Racist, Bop regrets stopping old truck and Myra four-star general exits a black SUV. Imagine this. You're driving down a quiet road minding your own business when out of nowhere you're pulled over by a police officer. The tension in the air is thick and something feels off. You don't know it yet, but this simple traffic stop is about to change everything in your life. What would you do if this small encounter led to something far bigger than you ever imagined? Well, this is the story of Ethan Carter, a former soldier now working in private security who finds himself caught up in a situation that no one could have predicted. He's about to face a decision that could not only change his career, but also the very values he holds dear. What happens next will leave you questioning the power of silence, the price of integrity, and whether standing up for what's right is always worth the cost. So before we dive into this wild journey, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from and what time is it there? Let us know in the comments below because we're curious to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin Ethan's story. Ethan Carter had seen his fair share of tough situations. As a 34-year-old former soldier turned private security contractor, he was used to the unexpected. But on this particular morning, everything was about to change. He was driving his old reliable truck heading to work when the flashing lights of a police car lit up his rearview mirror. The road was quiet, the sky was clear, and there didn't seem to be any reason for the stop. But as he pulled over to the side of the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A young officer stepped out of the patrol car. Officer Taylor. Ethan noticed the officer's rigid posture, the way he walked up to the truck with a sense of authority that felt almost unnecessary. Taylor didn't waste any time. Without even asking for his license and registration, he began scrutinizing Ethan's truck as if it were a crime scene. "What's with the old truck?" the officer sneered, inspecting it from bumper to bumper. Ethan could feel his patience starting to wear thin, but he chose to remain calm. "It's just a vehicle, officer, nothing more," he replied, keeping his tone steady, trying to diffuse the tension. But the officer wasn't having it. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as if looking for something, anything, to make this stop feel justified. "What's your purpose driving out here?" Taylor asked sharply, his voice full of suspicion. Ethan knew he didn't owe the officer an explanation, but he also knew how quickly things could escalate, and he wasn't about to give this young officer a reason to make his day worse. He tried to explain, but the words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer began digging into his papers, checking and rechecking, taking his time in a way that made Ethan uncomfortable. He felt the creeping unease in his chest. This wasn't just a routine stop. There was something more beneath the surface. Ethan could sense the power struggle. Officer Taylor was flexing his authority, testing how far he could push, how much he could control the situation. And Ethan, despite the urge to speak up, chose to stay quiet. He had learned that sometimes silence was the only response that kept everything from falling apart. The tension continued to build. Ethan could feel it in his bones. And though he was trying to stay calm, something inside him told him this wasn't just a random stop. It was a test of his patience, his dignity, and perhaps his very sense of self. As the officer walked back to his car, Ethan was left with a burning question. How far would he let this go before standing up for himself? It was in this moment that the true lesson emerged, a lesson about the fine line between remaining patient and not allowing yourself to be pushed too far. What would you do in Ethan's place? Stay silent and let it pass, or speak up and risk the consequences? Stay tuned because this encounter is far from over. The engine of Ethan's truck hummed quietly as he sat in the driver's seat, still processing the unexpected stop by Officer Taylor. The situation had been tense, but now that the officer had gone back to his patrol car, Ethan's mind started to race. He was trying to keep calm, but his thoughts were racing. The whole encounter felt strange, like something was just off. Why had the officer been so focused on his old truck? And why had he been so condescending even when there was no reason to be? As Ethan tried to push the thoughts aside, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Startled, he fumbled to pull it out, only to see the name flashing on the screen. General Sarah Adams. His heart skipped a beat. Sarah Adams was no ordinary person in his life. She was a powerhouse, a high-ranking officer in the military, and more importantly, a friend from his past. He quickly answered the call. "Ethan, it's Sarah." Her voice came through firm and clear as always. Listen, I don't have much time, but there's something big going on in your area. The police have been involved in something shady, and I'm afraid you're going to get pulled into it. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Sarah had never been one to make casual calls, especially with the weight of the military and its operations behind her words. What's going on? Ethan asked, his voice low now, fully alert. I can't give you all the details right now, but I can tell you this, your name is already being mentioned. The local police are involved in something that's bigger than what anyone realizes, and they're about to escalate it. You need to be ready. I don't know exactly how, but it's coming for you. Stay sharp, Ethan. As quickly as she'd called, the line went silent, leaving Ethan with the echo of her warning ringing in his ears. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. Something was coming, and it was bigger than just a random traffic stop. As he hung up the phone, a weight settled on his chest. He glanced up to see Officer Taylor still pacing around his truck, his actions now slower, more deliberate, as if he was in control. But the tension in the air was thick. It was as if time had stopped, and the world outside the truck had become a blur of uncertainty. Ethan's mind was racing, the details from Sarah's call spinning around in his head. The words, "Your name is being mentioned," echoed in his thoughts as if they were a signal, a warning. This wasn't just about a simple stop. It was something more, something that might change the course of everything. The police officer's attitude had shifted, his impatience becoming more obvious as he shuffled through the papers. Ethan didn't need to be a military strategist to know that he was standing at the precipice of something dangerous. The phone call from Sarah had shaken him more than he expected. He had always known that the world was never as simple as it appeared, but this call reminded him of the realities. He couldn't escape the connections, the ties, the weight of decisions that had long-reaching consequences. He had fought for his country, for his values, but now he was faced with a different kind of battle. It wasn't on a battlefield, but in the world of corruption, hidden agendas, and power dynamics that most people didn't even see. The officer's voice snapped Ethan out of his thoughts. "What's the holdup? Everything all right?" Taylor asked, his voice now full of irritation. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to shake off the wave of unease that had settled over him. He had to remain calm, had to figure out his next move. But now, with the knowledge of what Sarah had just shared with him, everything was different. This wasn't just about a simple stop anymore. It was about something much bigger, and Ethan could feel the storm building just out of reach. His heart was pounding, but he knew this was just the beginning. Whatever was coming, he couldn't avoid it, and it was coming faster than he ever imagined. What would happen next? Would Ethan stand up to the corruption that was about to unfold, or would he be caught in the web of deception? Stay tuned, because this story is only getting started. As Ethan stood beside his old truck, his heart racing and his mind still reeling from the phone call with Sarah, the world around him seemed to slow down. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the uncertainty of what was about to happen next. Officer Taylor was still walking back and forth, muttering to himself, seemingly unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing on the horizon. Ethan's thoughts kept returning to Sarah's words, her warning that something big was coming and that he was about to be a part of it. Then, just as the weight of the situation seemed unbearable, the sound of tires crunching against gravel broke through the haze of his mind. A sleek black SUV came into view, gliding down the road with an undeniable presence. The vehicle's polished surface gleamed under the harsh midday sun, its black windows reflecting the surroundings like a mirror. It was as if the world had shifted in an instant, and in that moment, Ethan could feel it. The change, the shift in energy that signified something was about to happen. The SUV came to a smooth stop, its engine purring softly before the door clicked open with an unmistakable finality. And then stepping out of the vehicle was none other than General Sarah Adams herself. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Sarah wasn't just any person to him. She was a powerful figure, a friend who had guided him through the most difficult of times during his military service. Her presence was commanding yet graceful, and in the quiet manner in which she moved toward him, Ethan felt both a sense of awe and comfort. There she was, the woman who had once stood beside him in the heat of battle, now stepping into the fray of something completely different, but no less important. As Sarah approached, Ethan noticed how the atmosphere around them seemed to change. Officer Taylor, who had been pacing around Ethan's truck just moments before, froze in his tracks. His eyes widened slightly and his posture stiffened. It was clear that he recognized the general, he knew who she was, and that knowledge was enough to shift the entire dynamic of the situation. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment. It was as though time itself had suspended its breath, waiting for the next move, the next words to break the silence. The young officer who had once held the power to intimidate Ethan with his rude questioning now seemed small in comparison to the woman who was walking toward them. Sarah's calm demeanor radiated strength, her every step measured and deliberate. She had the kind of presence that demanded respect, and even the seasoned officer seemed to know it. "General Adams," Taylor stammered, his voice unsteady. "I didn't know you were in the area." His words hung in the air as though he had lost the ability to form his thoughts coherently in the face of Sarah's unwavering authority. Ethan stood silently, taking in the scene before him. The officer's discomfort was palpable, but what caught his attention was the way Sarah held herself. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Her very presence conveyed the power she wielded. She didn't need to raise her voice to demand respect. It was simply given to her. And the young officer, despite his earlier bravado, understood that immediately. Sarah's gaze shifted from the officer to Ethan, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet understanding. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone spoke volumes, assuring Ethan that whatever was happening now, he was no longer alone in this fight. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Sarah's voice was calm, but there was an underlying steel to it. The words weren't directed at Ethan, but at the officer, as if she were making it clear that she was fully in control of the situation. Her tone didn't waver, and that unshakable confidence seemed to settle the tension in the air. Taylor, realizing that he was no longer in control of the situation, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His eyes darted between the general and Ethan, unsure of how to proceed. The power dynamics had changed so suddenly that he seemed completely at a loss. Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for Sarah's timely arrival. Without her, who knew how this would have played out? But now, in an instant, she had neutralized the tension, restoring order, with nothing more than a few words in her commanding presence. As Sarah stood next to Ethan, there was a brief but meaningful moment of silent acknowledgement between them. He knew that her involvement wasn't a coincidence. This was no longer just about a traffic stop. This was about something much bigger, something that Sarah had been tracking for some time. Ethan didn't need to ask any questions. He could feel it in the air. The weight of this encounter had shifted. What had once seemed like an insignificant moment in his day had now turned into something monumental. "Everything's fine now," Officer Sarah said coolly, her voice no longer needing to be raised. "You can go on with your day." And just like that, Taylor's authority was stripped away. He nodded hastily, muttering something incoherent, before walking back to his car and driving off, leaving Sarah and Ethan standing there, two figures on opposite sides of an invisible line that had been drawn without words. As the sound of the patrol car faded into the distance, Ethan turned to Sarah, his voice thick with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I didn't expect this. I didn't know where to turn, and then you showed up." Sarah smiled gently, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "Sometimes we don't know when we'll need someone to stand with us, but it's always nice to know someone has your back." In that moment, Ethan realized how much Sarah's presence meant. The world had a funny way of changing course when you least expected it. And now, with her by his side, the uncertainty of what was coming next didn't feel as overwhelming. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a while, Ethan felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. This moment with Sarah's quiet but powerful arrival would mark a turning point. The events that would follow would be shaped by this unexpected intervention. And Ethan knew that he was no longer just a passive observer in a world of unfolding events. He was an active participant in something that had the potential to change everything. And with Sarah by his side, he wasn't just facing the unknown, he was preparing to shape it. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a moment of power, and it was only the beginning of a much bigger story. As Sarah stood beside Ethan, her expression serious, she didn't waste any time. She had clearly come here for a reason, and now was the moment to share what had been weighing on her mind. Her voice was calm but firm, and as she spoke, Ethan felt a growing sense of unease that only deepened with every word. "You need to understand something, Thin," Sarah began, her eyes scanning the area around them, as though to make sure no one was listening. "The situation is far worse than it seems. The police officers you've been dealing with, Taylor and others like him, they aren't just enforcing the law. They're part of something much bigger, something you wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Ethan's mind raced. What do you mean? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. The weight of Sarah's words was starting to hit him. He couldn't quite process it yet, but there was a sinking feeling in his gut that told him this wasn't going to be good. Sarah looked at him directly, her gaze unflinching. There are connections, Ethan. Corruption runs deep, and I'm not just talking about a few bad apples. It's systemic. She paused, her face hardening as she spoke. The very people who are supposed to protect us, the ones we trust to uphold justice, some of them are involved in organized crime, drug deals, illegal gambling, and worse. They're using their power to control, to manipulate, and they've been doing it for years. And it's not just a few officers, this is a network. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The words she was saying didn't just hit hard, they shattered everything he thought he knew about the world around him. He had always trusted the system, believed that law enforcement was there to protect him, to protect everyone. But now that trust was slipping away faster than he could grasp. I didn't want to believe it at first either, Sarah continued, her voice softer now, but still filled with resolve. But I've seen the evidence, and it's not just about what's happening in this town. It's happening across the country in cities like this one. These officers are not just on the payroll of criminals, they're in it. They're benefiting from it. Ethan shook his head, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. How is this possible? How can something like this go unnoticed? That's the thing, Ethan, Sarah said, her voice steady. It's hidden in plain sight. It's covered up, swept under the rug by the people who should be stopping it. And those who try to expose it, well, they end up like you, caught in the crossfire. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Ethan felt the ground beneath him shift as the truth settled in. He wasn't just dealing with a random encounter with a power-hungry cop. He was stepping into a much larger battle, one that threatened to expose a network of corruption at the heart of the system. I don't know what to do with this, Sarah, Ethan said, his voice tinged with frustration. How do we fight something this big? How can I fight it if they've got control over everything? Sarah's eyes softened, but her resolve didn't waver. You don't have to fight it alone. That's why I'm here, Ethan. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about the truth and about making sure it doesn't stay buried any longer. She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. There are people out there who are working to bring this all to light. And you're part of it now. Whether you like it or not, you've been dragged into this. But you have a choice. You can sit back and let it happen, or you can stand up and do something about it. Ethan's mind was still reeling from everything Sarah had just revealed, but he knew one thing for certain: his life was never going to be the same again. He had thought that the worst part of his day was a simple traffic stop, but now it seemed like he was on the edge of something much bigger, something he couldn't ignore. This is bigger than I thought, Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to Sarah. He felt the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. Sarah gave him a sharp look, her voice firm once more. It always is, Ethan. When you realize the truth, it's never just a simple matter of right or wrong. It's about a system that's broken, and it's about standing up to it, no matter the way. Ethan looked out over the road, his eyes narrowed in thought. The world he had once trusted was suddenly turning upside down, and there was no going back. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this, not after everything Sarah had shared. This was his moment to decide whether to stay silent or to fight for what was right. The lesson was clear: the world wasn't as black and white as he had once thought. There were shades of gray in every system and every organization, and some of them were darker than he could have ever imagined. But sometimes uncovering the truth meant facing the hardest choices of all. And in that moment, Ethan understood that there would be no easy answers. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let the story fade into the shadows. Ethan stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of Sarah's words settling on him like a thick fog. He had never imagined that a simple, ordinary day would spiral into something so complicated. The truth had been laid bare before him. He was in the middle of a system that wasn't just broken, but deeply corrupted. And now he had to decide what to do about it. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The world around him seemed to fade, and all that remained was the sound of his own breath, shallow and quick, as he grappled with the decision that lay before him. Should he walk away, turn his back on everything he'd worked for, knowing that by doing so, he was leaving behind a career that had defined him for so long? Or should he stay, swallow the bitter truth, and allow himself to become part of a system that he knew was wrong? The choice was anything but easy. Ethan had always been a man of integrity, someone who had built his life on doing what was right even when it was hard. But the reality was staring him in the face now. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the corruption that ran through the police force, through the very system he had trusted, couldn't be denied. And if he stayed, if he kept his silence, he would be complicit. How could I continue like this? Ethan muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. He glanced at Sarah, who stood by his side, waiting for him to make his decision. Her eyes were steady, but there was a hint of concern in them. She knew this moment would be the hardest of all. Sometimes the hardest choice isn't just about doing the right thing, Sarah said softly, her voice filled with understanding. It's about walking away from everything you have worked for, even when you know it's the right thing to do. It's not about the career, Ethan. It's about who you are and what you're willing to stand for. Her words cut through the tension, striking a chord deep within him. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who could be counted on in the toughest of times. But this was different. The consequences of his decision would affect more than just his career. It would affect his sense of self, his future, and the people he cared about. Ethan knew that walking away would mean sacrificing the life he had built. The job he loved, the stability he had fought for, the friendships he had made, it would all be gone. But in the same breath, staying would mean becoming part of something corrupt, something that went against everything he believed in. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him, the pressure building with every passing second. This wasn't just a career choice, it was a moral dilemma that would shape the rest of his life. Do I stay and protect my career, or do I leave and protect my integrity? Ethan asked aloud, his voice cracking as the weight of his question hung in the air. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She simply stood there watching him with a quiet intensity, as if she knew the gravity of the decision he faced. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but firm. Ethan, you can't protect your integrity if you're willing to let it go for the sake of your job. No amount of money, no amount of recognition will ever be worth losing yourself. It's not easy. But sometimes the hardest choice is the one that leads to the most peace. Her words hit home. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he realized the truth of what she was saying. Staying in a system that was rotten to the core wasn't just dangerous, it was dishonest. He couldn't pretend that everything was okay when he knew deep down that it wasn't. The truth was clear, now he had to leave. But the decision wasn't as simple as walking away. It was about understanding that by leaving, he was taking a stand. It was about rejecting a system that valued power over truth and choosing to live a life that reflected his values. Ethan took a deep breath, looking around at the familiar surroundings. The job he had once loved, the colleagues he had once trusted. All of it now seemed so far removed from the person he wanted to be. The thought of walking away was overwhelming, but he knew it was the only choice that truly aligned with who he was. I'll leave, he finally said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside. I'll walk away from it all, because my integrity, my peace of mind, is worth more than anything I could gain from staying. Sarah's expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a sense of relief. It wasn't easy, it wasn't simple, but it was the right decision. Sometimes, Sarah said with a small knowing smile, the hardest thing is the right thing, but I have no doubt that you'll find peace in it. You've made the right choice. As he stood there facing the road ahead, Ethan felt a sense of clarity wash over him. The world wasn't as simple as he had once thought, but now at least he knew where he stood. His integrity was worth more than anything else, and that was a foundation he could build on. The lesson was clear sometimes. The most difficult decisions are the ones that define us. But in the end, it's our character, our values that will guide us through even the toughest of times. Ethan took one last look at the life he was leaving behind, then turned and walked away, ready to face whatever came next with a clear conscience and a heart full of strength. Ethan's decision to leave the system and stand up for what he believed in came with consequences he never anticipated. The initial sense of relief of knowing he had done the right thing was quickly overshadowed by the harsh reality that followed. As he walked away from the life he once knew, he couldn't escape the harsh stares and whispered conversations that seemed to follow him wherever he went. His decision to reject the corruption he had discovered within the police force wasn't just a personal choice. It had become a public declaration, one that would change the way others saw him forever. At first, Ethan hoped that those who truly knew him, those who valued his character, would understand his choice. But the reality was far more complicated. The respect he had earned over the years was overshadowed by the fact that he had chosen to stand against the very system he had once been a part of. The messages, the calls, and the faces that avoided him, all of it hit him harder than he had expected. The weight of standing alone in a battle against a system that seemed so deeply entrenched was more isolating than he could have ever imagined. He had always prided himself on his relationships with his colleagues, the bonds that had been formed over years of shared experiences. Yet now, as he navigated through the fallout of his decision, he found that many of those relationships were crumbling before his eyes. He couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal, as friends he had trusted turned their backs on him. They couldn't understand the deep moral conflict that had driven him to make such a radical choice. To them, Ethan was a traitor, someone who had abandoned the brotherhood they had built within the system. They couldn't see the integrity that had guided him. They only saw a man who had broken ranks. In the midst of this social exile, Ethan found himself alone more than ever. He spent his days reflecting on the decision he had made, wondering if it had been worth the cost. His phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was never with good news. Former colleagues now avoided him, leaving him to confront the reality of being ostracized for doing what he thought was right. And yet, amidst the isolation, there were still a few who reached out, a few who understood, and their words meant more than Ethan could have ever expected. They expressed their admiration, their respect for his courage in standing up for what he believed in. These few voices reminded him that not all was lost. There was still honor in his decision, even if it came at the cost of social acceptance. Ethan's journey into solitude wasn't without its challenges. He began to question his place in the world, wondering if the isolation was worth the principles he had fought for. In a society that so often values conformity and loyalty to the system, standing up against injustice felt like an act of defiance, a defiance that left him vulnerable, exposed, and without the support he had once taken for granted. But as time passed, Ethan began to realize that the price of standing up wasn't just measured in the relationships he had lost, it was also measured in the growth he had gained. His sense of self, once so deeply tied to his career and the approval of others, began to evolve. He no longer sought validation from the very system he had left behind. Instead, he sought something deeper, a sense of inner peace that came from knowing he had done what he felt was right. Through this painful period of isolation, Ethan learned a valuable lesson: standing up for what is right doesn't come without a cost. The cost might be relationships, the cost might be reputation, but the price of silence in the face of injustice is far greater. It was a harsh reality, one that Ethan had to come to terms with, but in the end it made him stronger, more resolute in his beliefs. As he sat in the quiet moments of reflection, he thought about the voices of those who had supported him and the few who had stood by his side. He realized that true integrity wasn't about the number of people who stood with you, it was about the courage to stand alone when necessary. The journey wasn't easy and it wasn't without pain, but Ethan began to understand that standing up for what is right isn't just about the external battles. It's also about the internal transformation that happens when you choose to live with honor, regardless of the cost. The lesson that Ethan took from this period of his life was profound. It wasn't just that standing up for justice can lead to isolation, but that the strength to face that isolation and to rise above it was the truest form of courage. It wasn't easy and it didn't come without its sacrifices, but in the end, the price of standing up was one that Ethan was willing to pay. As he continued his path forward, he knew that the journey wasn't over. The fight for justice was ongoing, and he would continue to walk it with the knowledge that he had chosen the right path. The sacrifices had been worth it, and in the silence that followed, Ethan found a strength he never knew. He had an inner peace that could not be taken from him. Sometimes the most painful moments lead to the greatest revelations. Ethan now understood that standing up for what's right may leave you with scars, but those scars are what shape you into a person of true integrity and strength, and that in the end is what mattered most. As Ethan stood in the dimly lit room with Tung Sarah Adams, The weight of the conversation began to settle in. She had been a guiding force in his life, a mentor who had taught him the importance of courage, and now she was showing him a path that wasn't about loud protests or public outcry, but about quiet, powerful resistance. You don't always need to shout to make your voice heard, she said, her voice calm yet firm. Sometimes the most profound changes happen when you act silently with purpose. Your actions, Ethan, they can speak louder than any words ever could. Ethan nodded, trying to process the gravity of what she was saying. They weren't talking about a grand display of power or some revolutionary speech in front of a crowd. They were talking about a quiet, methodical resistance that would not rely on force, but rather on the strength of integrity and unwavering conviction. As the conversation continued, it became clear to Ethan that the system he was up against was powerful, deeply entrenched in ways he hadn't fully realized. He had always thought that speaking out, confronting those in charge directly, would be the way to make a difference. But Tong Adams was offering a different perspective, one that required more patience, more subtlety, but ultimately might have a deeper and more lasting impact. Ethan had spent his life as a soldier, accustomed to the rhythm of command and control. He had always known what to do, what to say, and how to act in high-stress situations. But now, faced with a system that was crumbling under its own corruption, he was being asked to fight a battle of silence. It was a daunting thought. How could he make a difference without raising his voice, without calling attention to the very problems that needed to be fixed? But Tong Adams was resolute in her belief. In situations like this, the most powerful thing you can do is lead by example. The less noise you make, the more you will be heard. Actions have a way of resonating long after the words fade away. It was a lesson that seemed counterintuitive at first, especially to someone like Ethan, who had always been a man of action. He was used to taking swift, decisive steps, making his presence known, and ensuring that his voice was heard. Yet as he thought about it more, he realized the truth in her words. The more visible a person became in their resistance, the more likely they were to be shut down, dismissed, or ignored. In the silence and the quiet persistence of righteous action, there was a power that couldn't be so easily extinguished. Ethan began to understand the brilliance of the strategy. It wasn't about abandoning his principles or allowing corruption to continue unchecked. It was about finding a way to navigate through the system, to subtly shift its gears without drawing the attention of those who would stop him. It was about working from the inside, using his position and his knowledge to spark change without anyone realizing the force behind it. The challenge was immense. Ethan wasn't just fighting against a corrupt system. He was fighting against years of established power, decades of institutionalized control. But he wasn't alone. With Tong Adams by his side, he had a mentor who had faced similar battles, who had seen firsthand how even the smallest action, when done with purpose and conviction, could have a ripple effect far beyond what anyone could imagine. As the days passed, Ethan and Tong Adams began to work behind the scenes. Their resistance wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't immediate. But in the small, unnoticed ways, they started to affect the system. They leveraged their positions, influencing decisions, gathering information, and quietly turning the tide without anyone knowing. They knew that the system they were fighting against wouldn't crumble overnight. It would take time, patience, and strategic thinking. But with every subtle change, every quiet victory, they began to see the cracks in the foundation. The system was starting to shake slowly, almost imperceptibly. But it was happening. Ethan had always believed that to make a change, you had to be bold, loud, and forceful. But through this quiet resistance, he learned that sometimes the most significant changes come from within, from the power of action that speaks louder than any words ever could. As time went on, Ethan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known before. There was a quiet strength in knowing that his actions, no matter how small, were making a difference. He no longer needed to fight for the recognition or approval of others. The satisfaction came from the knowledge that he was doing the right thing in the most powerful way possible. The lesson was clear: action, when done with purpose, has a force of its own. And in the silence of that action, change could be created in ways that words never could. Ethan understood now that resistance didn't always have to be loud to be effective. In fact, sometimes it was the quietest, most resolute actions that left the biggest mark on the world. As the days passed, whispers began to circulate throughout the community. What started as a single act of resistance from Ethan and Tong Adams quietly began to gain traction. People who had once turned a blind eye to the injustices around them now started to question the system they were a part of. Small conversations, once hushed and quick, began to grow louder. And with each word spoken, a spark of change ignited. Ethan, still processing the quiet power of his own actions, had no idea that his story was slowly weaving its way through the fabric of the community. At first, it seemed as though nothing was happening. The system still felt as powerful as ever with its routines and its rigid control over every aspect of life. But in the corners, in the spaces where people were beginning to talk, something was shifting. The truth that Ethan and Tong Adams had been quietly working to uncover was slowly beginning to spread. It was subtle at first. Conversations in local coffee shops, at the post office, in break rooms during lunch. A colleague would mention something, an offhand remark about corruption within the force. Another would nod, reluctantly agreeing, but the topic was always quickly brushed aside until it wasn't anymore. People were beginning to ask questions that they hadn't dared ask before. They started to realize that their own lives, their own jobs, were affected by the system that Ethan and Tong Adams had begun to challenge. The change was slow, so slow that many of the people involved didn't even realize it was happening at first. They weren't marching in the streets, holding signs or shouting slogans. No, the change was taking root quietly, like seeds planted deep in the soil, ready to bloom when the time was right. Those who had been quietly observing Ethan and Sarah began to reflect on their own roles in the system. Some felt guilty, others felt angry. But all of them felt something stir inside them, a sense that perhaps it was time to stop looking away. Soon, whispers turned into open discussions. People who had once been silent found their voices. It was as if Ethan's quiet resistance had given them permission to speak up. A movement, small at first, began to take shape. A movement that didn't rely on loud protests or dramatic confrontations, but on honest conversations about truth, justice, and the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. What Ethan and Tong Adams had started was now a ripple effect, slowly moving outward, touching more and more people as it spread. It wasn't long before the community began to shift. What had once seemed like an insurmountable system of control began to crack. People who had previously been too afraid to speak out found strength in one another. They realized that they weren't alone in their concerns. They weren't the only ones who had seen the cracks in the facade, the injustices that had been swept under the rug for so long. And as they came together, they began to form a collective voice, one that was not as easily ignored. But the change didn't come without its challenges. For every new voice that joined the conversation, there was resistance. Some tried to shut it down, dismissing it as mere gossip or rumors. Others attempted to discredit those speaking out, claiming they were exaggerating or misunderstanding the situation. But the more the movement grew, the harder it became to ignore. It was no longer just a handful of voices whispering in the dark corners of the community. It was a chorus of voices, all demanding that the truth be heard. Ethan watched from the sidelines, still not fully grasping the magnitude of what was happening. He had never set out to start a movement. He had only wanted to do the right thing, to live with integrity, to stand up for what he believed in. But now, as he saw the community beginning to change, he realized that his small act of resistance had triggered something far greater than he had ever imagined. The truth was beginning to shine through the cracks, and there was no turning back now. The system, once so solid and unshakable, was now facing its own reckoning. It wasn't going to collapse overnight, and it wasn't going to be easy. But the shift had begun, and with every new conversation, every new voice that joined in the community moved closer to a new reality, one where justice, honesty, and integrity could take root. And as the movement grew, the lessons became clear. Change is never immediate. It never comes in the form of a sudden explosion, a dramatic moment of revolution. No change is quiet. It starts small, with just a few voices, a few people willing to stand up and speak the truth. But once it starts, it builds. It gains momentum. It becomes unstoppable. Ethan realized that the small actions they had taken, his quiet resistance, Tong Adams' guidance, had sparked something much larger than themselves. They had shown others that it was possible to make a difference, even without shouting, even without violence. They had shown that sometimes the most powerful change comes from the smallest actions, from the courage to speak the truth when others are too afraid to do so. And in that realization, Ethan found hope. The hope that change, no matter how slow, was possible. And that hope spread like wildfire through the community. What began as a quiet moment of resistance had become a movement, a shift in the very fabric of society. And it was just the beginning. Ethan sat quietly in the small cabin he had rented on the outskirts of town, away from the noise and demands of the world that seemed to constantly pull at him. It was here in the stillness that he found the peace he had longed for. The hustle and bustle of fame, of becoming a symbol for a cause, was never what he had sought. For the first time in years, he felt free. He didn't have to answer to anyone, didn't have to fight battles that weren't his to fight. His decision to step away from the spotlight had been a difficult one. The offers to become a public face for various movements had come pouring in. Organizations eager to use his story to rally others, to turn him into a beacon of hope for those fighting against corruption and injustice. But the more he was offered, the more he realized that the life they were proposing wasn't his to live. He didn't want to be a symbol for something. He wanted to be himself, a man who had done the right thing in a world full of noise and chaos. And so he turned down every offer, every invitation. He walked away from the opportunities to be celebrated, to be adored by people who only knew his story from the outside. He chose instead to live a life that was quieter, slower, and more meaningful. A life where his actions could speak for themselves without the need for a microphone or a spotlight. He no longer sought validation from others because he had found validation within himself. In the quiet of his new life, Ethan found something that had been missing for so long: peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop trying to prove yourself to the world. The kind of peace that settles in your soul when you no longer have to fight against the current, when you can simply exist without the weight of expectations. Ethan realized that true freedom wasn't found in the applause or admiration of others. It wasn't found in the recognition of his name or the titles that could come with it. True freedom, he discovered, was in the quiet moments, the stillness that allowed him to think clearly, to reflect, and to heal. He often thought about the path he could have taken. The fame, the platform, the power. It would have been so easy to let the world tell him what he should become. But he knew deep down that none of that would have given him the peace he craved. The peace that came from living authentically without the pressure of becoming someone else's idea of what he should be. The truth was, the world didn't need another symbol of hope. What it needed, what Ethan needed, was to be at peace with himself. In the mornings, he would take long walks along the nearby river, the cool air brushing against his skin, the sound of the water flowing over the rocks, grounding him in the present moment. There were no cameras, no expectations, just him and the world around him. It was in these moments that he felt the weight of his past decisions lift off his shoulders. He had chosen the harder road, yes, but in doing so, he had freed himself from the chains of others' expectations. He had seen firsthand the cost of fame, the toll it took on your soul when you were constantly under scrutiny, constantly trying to live up to others' ideals. But the greatest realization came when he understood that peace wasn't something you could find on the outside. It wasn't something you could achieve through titles or accolades. It was a quiet inner stillness that came from aligning yourself with your values and letting go of everything else. Ethan knew that in a world driven by success and recognition, many people would never understand his choice. To them, his decision might seem like a step backward, a missed opportunity, but to him, it was the clearest step forward he could take. He had chosen a life that allowed him to breathe, to be himself without the pressure of fitting into someone else's idea of what he should be. And in that choice, he found something far more valuable than any recognition. He found his own freedom. In the quiet of his life, Ethan had discovered the greatest truth: freedom and peace could never be bought with fame or money. They were gifts that came when you were brave enough to walk away from the noise, to stop chasing after what everyone else said you should want, and to embrace the simplicity of just being who you are. And so as Ethan looked out over the peaceful landscape before him, he knew that he had made the right choice. A life without fame, without applause, but full of the quiet contentment that comes from knowing you've lived truthfully, authentically. In the end, it wasn't the recognition he had wanted, but the peace of mind that came from standing firm in his own truth. And that Ethan realized was the greatest reward of all. As the years passed, Ethan's life continued to unfold quietly, away from the world's gaze, but with a ripple effect that began to reach farther than he could have ever imagined. His decision to stand up for his truth in silence had not only freed him, but had ignited something within others. The small acts of resistance, the quiet moments of courage began to grow into something much larger. His choice to walk away from the chaos of public life, choosing instead the path of inner peace, became a silent rallying cry for those who were tired of the noise, the expectations, the hollow victories. Ethan had become an unexpected symbol of quiet strength. It was in his stillness that he found his voice, a voice that spoke volumes. His story didn't need loud proclamations or public speeches. It was in his actions that change took root. In his choice to leave the world of power and fame behind, he had demonstrated that one quiet, determined person could in fact create a seismic shift in the world around them. He had proven that you didn't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful messages came from the softest voices. Ethan's legacy was not in the accolades he could have accumulated, but in the way he quietly inspired others to stand up for their beliefs. He showed them that they didn't have to fight the system with anger and violence. Change didn't always come from the top down, but from individuals who had the courage to stay true to themselves even when it was uncomfortable. It wasn't the grand gestures that mattered. It was the small acts of defiance, the silent resistance that created the foundation for something bigger. People started to notice Ethan's story, those who had once been too afraid to speak up themselves. They saw the quiet strength in his actions, and slowly the community around him began to change. His story was passed from person to person, each person taking a piece of it and making it their own. What started as one man's decision to live with integrity began to grow into a movement fueled not by words but by actions. It was proof that sometimes all it takes to start a revolution is a one person willing to stand alone quietly with strength. In the end, Ethan's greatest lesson wasn't just about standing up for what was right. It was about the power of silence. In a world that often demands loud voices, he showed that the softest whisper could carry the weight of an entire movement. It wasn't the noise that mattered, it was the message, the unshakable truth that no matter how quiet, it could still make an impact. So if you're feeling alone in your fight, remember Ethan's story. Remember that your silence is not a weakness, it is a strength. It may take time, but sometimes the quietest voices make the biggest difference. What change could you start just by standing still? If you believe in the power of quiet resistance, don't forget to subscribe and join the conversation. Let's change the world, one quiet voice at a time.